It wasn't a leak. It wasn't a rumor. It was a corporate death nail. With one chilling announcement, John Deere confirmed that all five of its U.S. manufacturing plants would be shut down immediately. No ceremony, no warning, just silence. For over a century, John Deere had been more than just a tractor company. It had built towns, sustained generations, and etched its identity deep into the heart of rural America. But now, those iconic green machines would no longer roll off assembly lines in Iowa or Illinois. What happened? The story isn't just about job losses. It's about a system that turned on itself. A political decision made in Washington meant to protect American jobs ended up detonating the very communities it was designed to save. How did it come to this? Was John Deere to blame? Or was it the government's policies that forced its hand? And most importantly, what does this collapse tell us about the fragile state of American manufacturing in the 21st century? This wasn't a slow, predictable decline. It was an eruption. The speed, scale, and silence of the shutdown sent shockwaves across Middle America. Entire communities were blindsided, betrayed, and left to pick up the pieces of what once was a symbol of national pride and industrial strength. The company that once stood as a beacon of American resilience had vanished overnight from its own backyard. In this investigation, we'll unpack the full scope of what happened, from the deafening silence in deserted towns to the backroom deals that shifted power overseas. We'll explore how a trade war meant to protect American soil ended up sowing economic ruin and triggering a cultural collapse. And we'll ask the hard questions. What does it mean to be an American company in a globalized economy? When loyalty is no longer mutual, who pays the price? Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now on to the video. Across small towns like Waterloo, Iowa, Moline, Illinois, and Salina, Kansas, silence descended like a fog. These weren't sleepy places. These were once bustling communities built around the rhythmic hum of John Deere's machinery, the clanging of metal on the factory floor, the beeping of forklifts, the shift changes at dawn and dusk, all gone. The announcement landed like a bomb. Parking lots emptied. Gates were padlocked. The yellow lines marking walkways through factory floors became ghostly reminders of a vibrant industrial past. In Waterloo, where one of Deere's most iconic plants had stood for decades, the mood turned apocalyptic. This wasn't just a job loss. It was a generational rupture. Fathers, sons, and grandsons had passed down jobs like family heirlooms. The plant was more than an employer. It was a pillar. It kept the high school football team funded, the local grocery stores open, and the heartbeat of the community steady. In Moline, Illinois, perhaps the company's spiritual home, the blow struck even deeper. Residents described the shutdown as a funeral. Local media called it the day the engine stopped. Businesses that had existed solely to serve Deere workers, from food trucks and barbershops to childcare centers, began shuttering one by one. Real estate agents watched property values plummet. Banks reclassified loans. The collapse was swift, brutal, and all-encompassing. In Salina, Kansas, the ripple effect was just as destructive. Real estate markets crashed. Small business loans defaulted. Tax revenues evaporated. These weren't just financial losses. They were existential shocks, the kind that tear at the social fabric of a town, the kind that erase identity. These towns didn't just lose an employer, they lost their soul. In Waterloo, a hardware store owner recalled how John Deere contracts had accounted for 80% of his business. He had to lay off his entire staff and close within a month. In Moline, a public school district announced emergency budget cuts after sponsorships and community donations dried up. And in Salina, residents who had never lived anywhere else packed up and left, knowing full well the town's best days were behind it. These communities had spent decades believing in one thing, that John Deere would always be there. It was more than a brand, it was a way of life. When the company left, it took more than just jobs. It took stability, legacy, and hope. And as the engine stopped, a deeper silence settled in, a silence that spoke volumes. The irony was brutal. The very policy that was supposed to protect American manufacturing ended up being its greatest threat. In the early days of Donald Trump's second term, his administration rolled out an aggressive trade policy centered around tariffs. The idea was simple: punish foreign manufacturers and protect American jobs. If you don't make it here, don't sell it here, he declared from podiums across the heartland. The message resonated. American workers had watched factories vanish and jobs migrate overseas for decades. The promise of reshoring American industry ignited a wave of optimism. But what unfolded with John Deere revealed a devastating flaw in that plan. Unlike many corporations that had offshored years ago, Deere had stayed. It had doubled down on its American roots, pumping billions into domestic facilities, supporting technical education programs, and embracing American labor. But that very loyalty made it vulnerable. When the tariffs were introduced, countries like Brazil, Germany, and China retaliated by slapping their own levies on US made goods. Agricultural equipment was hit hard. Deere's global customers were now faced with impossible choices. Buying American meant paying 20 to 40% more. Alternatives like Mahindra, Kubota, and Clayas swooped in. Within months, Deere's international orders plummeted. Revenue forecasts were gutted. The company's executives began confronting a horrifying reality. Staying loyal to America was a losing strategy in a world governed by retaliatory trade barriers. CEO John May, in a leaked internal memo, described it as the pivot point. The board convened emergency meetings. Analysts scrambled to revise projections. Investors started asking uncomfortable questions. What started as patriotic policy quickly became a corporate death sentence. To survive, Deere had to act. And acting meant cutting off the very towns that had supported it for generations. The decision wasn't taken lightly, but it was definitive. The shutdowns began quietly, with scaled back production. Then came the severance packages. Then silence. Executives justified the move by pointing to global competitiveness, but inside America's borders, the message felt like betrayal. What was meant to save American industry had, in effect, pushed one of its most iconic names to leave. The paradox was complete. The economic chain reaction from John Deere's departure was immediate and unrelenting. In the weeks following the announcement, thousands of workers received pink slips. Factories that once buzzed with life now stood as hollow steel skeletons. But the real damage rippled far beyond factory gates. Take Waterloo. Before the shutdown, the town had enjoyed a stable economy supported by Deere's steady demand. Suppliers operated at full capacity. Repair shops had wait lists, and students at the local community college enrolled in diesel tech with confidence. Within 30 days of the shutdown, 15 local vendors closed their doors. Families left town in search of work, leaving behind empty homes and shuttered storefronts. In Moline, it wasn't just the workers who suffered. Local high schools saw enrollment drop. City councils scrambled to reallocate budget funds once filled by property taxes from Deere-affiliated families. Parks fell into disrepair. Community events were canceled. One restaurant owner, whose business had operated since the 1970s, described the atmosphere as post-apocalyptic. The collapse extended into seemingly untouchable institutions. The community banks, which had offered favorable loan terms to Deere employees for generations, began tightening credit. Loans once seen as safe suddenly became high risk. Small business owners defaulted. Families stopped spending. A town built on optimism sank into despair. Even regional agriculture took a hit. Farmers who relied on Deere's presence for quick equipment repairs now faced long delays, or worse, no service at all. The loss of these hubs created gaps that could not be filled by other providers overnight. The effect was cumulative and catastrophic. Social bonds began to fray. Churches started holding job prayer circles. Divorce rates spiked. Mental health clinics reported upticks in stress-related conditions. The silence was not just economic, it was cultural, psychological, and generational. John Deere's exit didn't just damage towns, it erased their futures. What do you do when your town's economic engine disappears overnight? For many, there was no roadmap, only questions, empty streets, and boarded up dreams. Even as factories closed and workers packed up their toolkits, another domino was quietly falling. John Deere's expansive dealership network. Spread across America like arteries pumping life into rural economies, these dealerships were more than just showrooms. They were support centers, community hubs, and lifelines for farmers. With the factories idle and orders canceled, these once busy outposts were left flailing. Dealership owners had no advance warning. Phone calls from panicked suppliers began flooding in. Orders were postponed, then canceled outright. Inventory that was expected for harvest season never arrived. In many cases, even basic replacement parts like belts, oil filters, and sensors were nowhere to be found. One Iowa-based dealer, Mike Colson, a third-generation franchise owner, said bluntly, "We've always been able to count on Deere. Now we're fielding calls from customers asking if we're going out of business too." Mike wasn't alone. Across states like Nebraska, North Carolina, and Indiana, dealers who had spent decades building loyal customer bases were blindsided. They had made significant investments in expanded service bays, advanced diagnostic equipment, and in-house financing programs, all predicated on a promise of continuity from Deere. That promise now rang hollow. The service departments took the hardest hit. With no new inventory and no access to replacement parts, even minor repairs became logistical nightmares. A broken axle that once took 48 hours to replace now left multimillion-dollar combines sidelined for weeks. Technicians, once the heartbeat of these dealerships, sat idle. Some were laid off, others quit, unsure when or if their workload would return. Farmers, frustrated by delays and rising maintenance costs, began hoarding spare parts. Some turned to used parts markets. Others started cannibalizing their own outdated equipment to keep newer machines running. One Kansas farmer welded together two old tractor axles just to stay operational through planting season. Meanwhile, communication from Deere Corporate was vague at best. Dealerships received templated updates referencing logistics restructuring and global supply optimization. But there were no clear timelines, no strategy, no leadership. Left in the dark, dealers started to lose more than just revenue. They lost faith. Many franchise owners had weathered past economic downturns. They had stuck with Deere through the 2008 financial crisis, through commodity crashes and tech disruptions. But this was different. This felt permanent. The betrayal ran deeper than dollars. It went to the core of community identity. Loyalty turned to resentment. In the absence of parts, products, and plans, dealerships became ghost buildings. The signature green and yellow banners still fluttered in the breeze, but behind the windows, lights were off. For customers driving by, it was like looking at a time capsule, a remnant of a world that had suddenly moved on. And it wasn't just a business loss, it was a psychological rupture. The rural Midwest had long been sustained by trust between manufacturers, dealers, and communities. When that trust eroded, what remained was uncertainty, anger, and a deep sense of abandonment. John Deere wasn't just a manufacturer, it was a symbol. For millions of Americans, especially in the Midwest and the South, that green and yellow logo represented more than machinery. It stood for tradition, resilience, craftsmanship, and pride. You could find it stitched into ball caps, painted on barn walls, printed on birthday cakes. Country songs wrote odes to it. Local parades rolled out floats shaped like tractors. It was a cultural icon. So when John Deere left, it wasn't just jobs that vanished. It was identity. In towns like Ottumwa, Iowa, or Decatur, Illinois, the psychological toll was staggering. Churches began holding prayer circles not for rain, but for jobs. High school football teams lost their sponsors. Cafes and diners that once served morning coffee to Deere employees saw their booths empty. Communities that had once felt proud and rooted now felt betrayed and adrift. The timing couldn't have been worse. Many of these towns had pinned their hopes on Trump's promises of a manufacturing renaissance. They had voted for tariffs, believing it would bring back factories, raise wages, and restore economic dignity. Instead, they watched their most beloved company collapse under the weight of those very policies. "We backed the man because he said he'd protect us," said Randy Hole, a corn farmer in Indiana. "But now I can't even get parts for the tractor I bought last year. What does that tell my son?" The betrayal felt personal. For generations, farmers had trusted Deere as a partner in their success. They passed down tractors like family heirlooms. They wore the logo with pride. And now, when they needed Deere the most, it had disappeared. Some responded with protests, others responded with silence. A viral photo from a rural Ohio town showed a group of farmers spray painting "Traitor" across the side of a Deere dealership. In Kansas, local stores began pulling Deere merchandise from shelves in protest. Social media lit up with hashtags like #AdGreenGone and #DeerDesertedUs. But underneath the anger was something even more devastating: loss of meaning. What does it mean to work hard, stay loyal, and invest in your community only to have the rug pulled out from under you? For many, Deere's departure wasn't just the end of employment, it was the unraveling of a shared belief system. The tractors were still green, but the pride they once symbolized had faded to gray. As American communities wrestled with job loss and cultural trauma, the rest of the world saw opportunity. Nations that had long sought a larger slice of the global manufacturing pie sprang into action. Vietnam fast-tracked permits. Hungary offered workforce retraining programs. Romania slashed corporate taxes. Brazil expanded export subsidies. One country's collapse had become another's windfall. For countries like Vietnam and Brazil, the stakes were clear. John Deere wasn't just a company moving operations overseas. It was an entire ecosystem of economic potential. And these countries were eager to capitalize. In Vietnam, government officials unveiled a new industrial zone dedicated entirely to agricultural equipment. Construction crews broke ground within days of Deere's announcement. Incentives included duty-free export status, streamlined customs clearance, and infrastructure grants worth billions. Local universities launched diesel mechanics training programs almost overnight. In Eastern Europe, where economies have long sought diversification beyond tourism and agriculture, Deere's arrival was hailed as transformative. Romania promised to build a new rail hub just for Deere's supply chain. Hungary subsidized housing developments near factories to accommodate the incoming workforce. Media outlets ran triumphant headlines: "Deere comes east, green shoots of growth." Brazil, already a major agricultural powerhouse, doubled down. It extended Deere's land leases, fast-tracked its environmental licenses, and offered tax-free zones in return for technology transfers. Deere responded by announcing plans to build its largest overseas production facility just outside Sao Paulo. To emerging economies, this wasn't just foreign direct investment. It was a seismic shift. Deere brought not only jobs, but also a web of secondary industries: logistics firms, software vendors, precision farming startups, mechanical schools. The arrival of Deere became a blueprint for 21st century industrial development. This global realignment revealed something uncomfortable back in the U.S. The world was no longer waiting for America. As policymakers clung to slogans about reshoring and protecting domestic industry, other countries moved forward. They didn't see Deere's departure as a failure. They saw it as a leap forward. And in boardrooms around the world, executives took note. If even John Deere, an icon of American manufacturing, was willing to walk away from its homeland, what did that say about the future of the U.S. as a reliable industrial base? Back in Iowa, the factories stood empty. But halfway across the world, the green machines were already rolling off new lines. Globalization hadn't died. It had simply changed address. When the John Deere plant in Ottumwa, Iowa, shut its gates for the final time, it wasn't just a factory closure. It was a death knell echoing through every corner of the town's economy. In less than 24 hours, local contractors began canceling work orders tied to future plant expansions. Within 72 hours, the town diner laid off half its staff due to plummeting breakfast rushes. By the end of the first month, the city council convened an emergency budget meeting, not to plan growth, but to figure out what public services they could still afford. This wasn't a slow erosion of industry. It was an overnight implosion. Ottumwa wasn't some forgotten relic of the past. It was a thriving modern town with decades of dependable employment and stable livelihoods. The Deere plant was its beating heart. When that heart stopped, everything else flatlined. Auto dealerships reported a 30% decline in business within weeks. Child care centers saw enrollments plummet. Local banks quietly reclassified entire portfolios as high risk. Loan officers were instructed to deny refinancing applications from anyone previously employed at Deere. Retail businesses faced inventory gluts as spending ground to a halt. Even the local YMCA saw membership cancellations spike. At the community college, enrollment in programs like mechanical engineering and industrial automation collapsed. Professors who had spent years tailoring curriculum to Deere's technical requirements were told to pivot or risk being laid off. The pipeline from classroom to assembly line was severed. Meanwhile, families fled, not because they wanted to, but because staying became financially impossible. Moving trucks began lining the streets. Some households left in the dead of night to avoid the emotional weight of saying goodbye. "Deere was our plan," said one local mother. "We bought a house, built a life here because they were supposed to be forever." Real estate agents listed homes at reduced prices, but buyers were scarce. Who would move into a ghost town? And who would fund infrastructure upgrades or new schools when the tax base had evaporated? Ottumwa became a case study in economic fragility. It showed how interconnected rural America really is, how one company's exit could ripple across every facet of life. It wasn't just blue-collar jobs that disappeared. It was middle-class stability, civic pride, and a collective sense of purpose. And yet, as devastating as Ottumwa's fall was, it was not unique. Similar stories unfolded in Ankeny, Cedar Falls, and other Midwestern towns. This wasn't a localized incident. It was a systemic failure. And for every mayor scrambling to rewrite a budget, there was a high school senior rethinking their future. In Ottumwa, one such student tore up his college application after hearing the plant closed. "Why study robotics if there's nowhere to work?" he asked. It was a heartbreaking but rational question. And it was being asked in town after town. Ottumwa's mayor, a third-generation Deere employee before moving into politics, captured the town's despair in a somber televised interview. "This isn't just a plant closure," he said. "It's the unraveling of who we are." For generations of American farmers, John Deere was more than a supplier. It was a trusted partner, reliable, innovative, and intimately familiar with the rhythms of agricultural life. From planting season to harvest, those green machines weren't just equipment. They were family. And when Deere left, it didn't just disrupt business, it dismantled trust. The first shock was logistical. Without domestic production and distribution, parts became a nightmare to acquire. Deliveries slowed to a crawl. Inventories vanished. Wait times for critical components stretched from days to months. And in farming, time isn't just money, it's everything. Tractors broke down mid-season with no replacements in sight. Combines needed belts or sensors that were now weeks out. Mechanics who once turned around repairs in hours sat helpless. Farmers who depended on Deere credit financing were now holding on to expensive, immobile equipment they couldn't service. Next came the pricing spiral. Deere's overseas operations offered lower production costs, but those savings didn't reach U.S. consumers. Tariff backlash, shipping markups, and currency fluctuations created massive cost increases. A mid-range tractor that once sold for $130,000 suddenly cost $160,000. Financing became the final blow. Spooked lenders raised interest rates and tightened credit, especially for rural borrowers. Loan approvals plummeted. Down payments doubled. Long-standing customers were told their credit risk had changed. Farmers who had planned to expand or upgrade were forced to delay or cancel. The psychological toll was equally severe. For older farmers nearing retirement, the upheaval pushed them out early. For younger ones, the message was clear. Loyalty didn't pay. Some jumped ship to foreign brands like Kubota or Mahindra. Others left the industry entirely. "I spent 40 years using Deere," said one soybean farmer in Iowa. They left us with no backup plan, no warning, no help. Even customer support fell apart. Deere's once iconic U.S. call centers were replaced by offshore alternatives. Language barriers, time zone conflicts, and unfamiliarity with local crop cycles created friction. Farmers found themselves filing tickets to faceless support reps halfway across the world, hoping someone would understand the urgency of a combine breakdown during peak harvest. That disconnect shattered the relationship. It wasn't about a bad product, it was about broken expectations. The green paint hadn't faded, but the trust had. The question began to surface. Could a company still be American if it didn't support American farmers? And if the answer was no, what did that mean for the industry and for rural life as a whole? John Deere built more than tractors. It built an image, one rooted in Americana, in family farms, in mechanical ingenuity. It wasn't just selling equipment, it was selling permanence. The message was simple. When you buy green, you buy something built to last by people who understand your world. That message died the moment the factories closed. The company's advertising didn't skip a beat. Commercials continued to show amber waves of grain, children climbing into tractors with their grandparents, proud workers tightening bolts on factory floors. But the fine print told another story. Assembled in Malaysia. Global production partners. Gone were the words, made in the USA. The dissonance was jarring. Could Deere still be Deere if it wasn't American-made? Could it still represent the rugged spirit of rural resilience if its manufacturing base was now in Vietnam? For some, the answer was yes. A machine is a machine. For many more, the answer was no. John Deere's value wasn't just in horsepower or hydraulics, it was in history, in loyalty, in the knowledge that your father and grandfather had used the same brand. Social media exploded. Photos of scratched-out logos, spray-painted tractors, and discarded merchandise flooded platforms. Former customers posted emotional videos explaining why they were done with the brand. In Nebraska, a group of farmers organized a ceremonial funeral for their retired Deere fleet, complete with green-painted caskets. Inside Deere's headquarters, marketing teams scrambled. They pivoted toward messaging about global innovation and supply chain agility. But the more they leaned into buzzwords, the more they alienated their core customer base. The truth was simple. John Deere was no longer the company that your grandfather trusted. It was a multinational conglomerate with shareholders in mind, not soil. Loyalty had become a liability. Efficiency had become king, and for many that was unforgivable. What happened with John Deere wasn't just a company-specific tragedy. It was a turning point for corporate America. Executives across the country were watching, taking notes, and drawing conclusions. And what they saw was chilling. If a legacy brand like Deere, iconic, American, and embedded in generations of communities, wasn't safe from the fallout of political volatility, then no one was. Behind the polished boardroom doors, the shift was immediate. Scenario planning sessions erupted in multinationals from Detroit to Dallas. CFOs and operations leads began reassessing risk, not just the usual ones like supply chain delays or raw material fluctuations, but regulatory and political volatility within the United States itself. The new phrase that started appearing in internal memos: geopolitical fragility zones. And for the first time, America was on that list. Corporate advisors from the world's top consultancies issued quiet warnings. Investment banks began circulating memos advising caution around U.S.-centric manufacturing. Logistics strategists proposed moving key infrastructure out of the country, not because it was cheaper, but because it was safer. The calculus had changed. Where patriotism once held symbolic and even financial value, now it represented exposure. The lesson was clear. If a government can impose punitive tariffs overnight, and if those tariffs can wipe out entire markets with no safety net, then no brand is immune. And if that brand's identity is tied to its Americanness, then the fall is even harder. Some companies acted fast. Automation projects already underway were accelerated. Plans for new U.S. factories were shelved. Capital earmarked for American expansion was rerouted to Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe. Others explored dual headquarter models, maintaining a token presence in the U.S. while expanding executive teams abroad. A quiet exodus began. It wasn't loud. It didn't make front-page news, but you could see it in the numbers. Domestic equipment orders fell. Foreign direct investment into emerging economies ticked up. Private jet traffic between San Francisco and Singapore surged. The future wasn't abandoning America loudly. It was slipping away silently. John Deere's collapse didn't just crack open rural America. It cracked open corporate America's sense of stability. It drew a red line in the sand, a line that said, loyalty is conditional, permanence is a myth. And the game has changed. For decades, there was a sacred assumption in business. If you invested in your community, if you employed domestic workers, and if you weathered the hard times at home, you would be rewarded. That assumption had underpinned entire generations of industrial development. Now, it was shattered. Companies that once championed American exceptionalism began quietly stepping away from it. They weren't turning their backs on patriotism, they were hedging against unpredictability. And in doing so, they were redefining what it meant to be a global company in the 21st century. The implications are profound. If corporations no longer see America as a safe or profitable long-term bet, then the entire framework of domestic economic development is at risk. Job creation, community investment, even educational partnerships, all of it depends on a foundational belief that staying here is worthwhile. John Deere's story became the cautionary tale, not just for factories or dealerships, but for boardrooms and business schools. And the question they're now asking isn't whether to leave, but how fast they can do it if things go sideways. The red line has been drawn. The old rules are gone. And corporate America has entered a new era, one where survival doesn't depend on loyalty, but on agility. John Deere's departure from the United States marked more than a corporate pivot. It marked the end of an era, the collapse of a belief system built on permanence, patriotism, and mutual trust. For over a century, Deere had been a fixture in the American story. It stood for something. It represented resilience, craftsmanship, and continuity. But in the end, those values couldn't survive the hard math of global capitalism. The factories are gone. The workers have scattered. The trust is shattered, and the silence that remains is deafening. What we're left with is a new kind of uncertainty, one where the ground beneath us no longer feels stable, where yesterday's guarantees are today's risks, and where companies built on loyalty and identity now pivot to efficiency and survival. In small towns across the Midwest, the ghosts of green machines linger on dealer lots, in shuttered homes, in stories told over kitchen tables. The promise of Made in America has faded into a marketing myth. And perhaps the most chilling realization is this: the engines didn't just stop for John Deere. They stopped for the American dream. The idea that hard work, loyalty, and community investment would always be enough. So what comes next? For America's workforce, the answer may lie in reinvention. For its towns, resilience. And for its leaders, a hard reckoning with the policies and priorities that led us here. Because the day the engine stopped wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of something far more uncertain. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.